The town seemed harmless at first glance, the kind of place where life moved slowly, clocks ticked evenly, and street lamps hummed softly against the night. But the moment you lingered, even for a heartbeat, something whispered beneath the surface, an almost imperceptible tension threading through the air. Street corners that should have been familiar felt oddly elongated, shadows stretching where no light should fall. A lone dog barked far too late, then silence, broken only by the occasional gust that rattled window panes. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their eyes darting as if aware of something unseen, conversations trailing off mid-sentence, and doors clicking shut a beat too fast. The sidewalks were empty, yet the faint impression of movement haunted the corners of vision, a shifting sense that someone or something was always just out of sight. Even the lamplight, steady and yellow during the day, now flickered with subtle irregularities, casting dancing patterns on cracked asphalt, turning familiar shapes into momentary specters. Somewhere, a radio buzzed and warped, a soft voice saying words that almost made sense, only to vanish the next second. The air carried a chill, not the ordinary cold of autumn, but something deeper, as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for a night that would never truly arrive. And in the quiet, an uneasy question lingered, prickling the skin. Had anyone else noticed? Has anyone else felt the town lean toward something just beyond comprehension? Even the ordinary houses, with their familiar porches and sleeping pets, seemed to hum with expectation, a dormant awareness that stirred when darkness fell. You could walk the streets, hearing nothing but your own footsteps, yet feel eyes pressing against the edges of perception. And beneath it all, an almost human heartbeat of tension, the ordinary masking the extraordinary, the mundane holding secrets, the town itself seeming alive, awake in ways the townsfolk could not explain. The question remained, what had the night whispered to them, and what had they refused to answer? Even as the moon rose higher, casting pale light across the quiet roads, you could feel the weight of unspoken stories pressing against the walls of every home, leaving a lingering, undeniable sense that nothing here was as simple as it seemed. The moment the lights went out, the house exhaled a different kind of darkness, one that didn't belong to ordinary nightfall. Lying in bed, every creak and sigh of the old wooden floor seemed amplified, as though the house itself were breathing around the room. A soft flicker in the corner drew the eye, but when looked at directly, nothing was there, only shadows bending strangely against the walls. The clock ticked unevenly, skipping moments in silence, each lost second leaving a hollow echo in the chest, a feeling that time itself had begun to fracture. Beneath the floorboards, a faint hum began, low and insistent, like the pulse of some distant engine, or heartbeat that couldn't be located, couldn't be explained. Ordinary objects suddenly carried menace. A chair tilted slightly though it had been still for hours, a framed photo angled as if it had glanced at the room, books stacked neatly yet somehow unsettling. The air grew heavier, pressing on the chest, and every small sound became amplified. The shiver of wind outside, the distant bark of a dog, the irregular thrum of the heater. The mind raced, questioning perception. Was it imagination, exhaustion, or something else entirely? A whisper of doubt slithered in, perhaps noticing these things was dangerous, perhaps ignoring them was safer. But the choice was not easy, because the disturbances felt intentional, as if the house or whatever lingered unseen knew someone was watching. Eyes strained in the dark, ears alert to every skipped heartbeat, every fluttering shadow, while the hum persisted, vibrating through floor, wall, and bone alike. A thought crept forward, impossible to shake. What if curiosity itself was a signal? The night stretched endlessly, thick with expectation, every second weighing heavier than the last. Somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, the ordinary dissolved, leaving only the question that would not leave. Would you investigate or pretend you didn't hear it? And in that hesitation, The night began to stir fully, as though something had been waiting, quiet but attentive, and now it was awake. The morning revealed subtle changes that gnawed at the edges of reality, shifts too small to demand immediate attention but too precise to ignore. Drawers were slightly ajar, their contents rearranged just enough to be unsettling. A cup left on the counter tilted imperceptibly, its shadow stretching differently in the pale light. Symbols had appeared overnight in corners that had always been bare, scratches etched into wood, faint marks on walls, patterns that suggested intention, though their meaning was impossible to grasp. Even the digital world seemed to conspire. The phone glitched when opened, text messages appeared half-written and then vanished, emails reordered themselves as if the account had a mind of its own. Screens flickered with shapes that lasted only a heartbeat, vanishing before comprehension could catch them, leaving a residue of doubt and rising panic. The air itself seemed charged, carrying the faint metallic tang of electricity or fear, blending the ordinary with something that whispered of danger. Every familiar object suddenly demanded scrutiny, turning the mundane kitchen into a labyrinth of possible secrets. The protagonist's gaze lingered on the smallest details: a chair leg scratched, a picture frame slightly askew, a book spine turned inward as if hiding knowledge. Each discovery intensified the unease, a slow crescendo of suspicion. And then came the auditory anomalies, the softest thumps from inside walls, fleeting static through the speakers of a muted television, the faint echo of footsteps on stairs long abandoned. It was as though the house, or perhaps the town itself, was sending signals, guiding attention to things unseen, but never clarifying their purpose. A creeping realization surfaced. These disturbances were deliberate, meant to provoke observation, to demand questions without offering answers. The protagonist felt eyes on them, though no one was present, and an instinctual fear took root. Whatever was behind these signs was patient, intelligent, and aware. Notice anything strange in this room? The thought teased at the edge of consciousness, a silent invitation to acknowledge the unknown. Curiosity waged war with caution, each glance around the room reinforcing the certainty that something had changed fundamentally in the world they thought they knew. Ordinary life had fractured, leaving only the puzzle pieces, the subtle signs, and the gnawing question. What were they meant to reveal, and who or what had left them there? Stepping outside, the town seemed unchanged at first, as if the night's disturbances had been a private hallucination. Yet the air carried an unspoken tension, thick enough to taste. Conversations with neighbors were hesitant, cautious, voices dipping into whispers when the topic approached the strange events. Some denied seeing anything at all, brushing off odd occurrences as fatigue, imagination, or the exaggerations of a restless mind. Others leaned closer, eyes darting nervously, murmuring about disappearances that were never reported, about late-night lights that no one dared follow, about warnings whispered from one generation to the next. Don't investigate, don't look too long, don't ask questions. Each story conflicted with the last, a mosaic of half-truths and fearful speculation, leaving the protagonist unsure whom to trust. Footsteps echoed strangely in the alleyways, the faint hum of the town's unseen heartbeat pressing against the ears, as if the very air carried secrets. And then a neighbor, someone normally reserved, almost invisible in daily life, paused mid-sentence, eyes wide and trembling, voice barely audible. "I saw it too, but you shouldn't be here." The words hung heavy, more frightening in their hesitation than any explanation could have been. A chill ran down the spine, the ordinary suburban street now transformed into a stage for paranoia, every glance over a shoulder pregnant with suspicion. The protagonist felt the weight of unseen attention, the town's collective awareness pressing in, urging retreat yet demanding curiosity. Questions cascaded. What had the neighbor truly seen? Was the presence intelligent? Was it still watching? The whispers, the half-truths, and the warnings coalesced into a thick fog of doubt and anticipation, leaving the protagonist and the audience gripped by a single unanswerable question. One neighbor claims to have seen it too, but will they reveal the truth? The day began with an unsettling realization. Hours had disappeared, vanished without record, slipping through the cracks of memory as though they had never existed. The protagonist glanced at clocks that refused to align, watches ticking backward, and the digital glow of phones displaying timestamps that made no sense. Meals eaten felt half-remembered. Conversations repeated themselves word for word yet carried an eerie sense of déjà vu, and the path to familiar places now seemed distorted, corners appearing sharper, alleys longer, streets subtly rearranged. Objects shifted between glances, books no longer in their original stacks, doors slightly ajar though they had been locked. Even the sky seemed altered, sunlight cutting at an angle that contradicted the time, shadows stretching incorrectly across pavements. The creeping suspicion grew into tangible fear. Something or someone was tampering with reality itself. Patterns emerged in the disturbances. Repetition of events, glimpses of figures that vanished on approach, subtle rhythms in the house, the street, and even in the town's ambient noises, as though the world had a pulse independent of the living. The protagonist's mind spun, trying to find logic to account for these discrepancies, but each answer dissolved into more questions, leaving only the sensation of being adrift in a reality that obeyed rules they did not understand. Sleep offered no relief. Dreams mirrored missing hours, blending fragments of memory with invented events, making the boundary between perception and fabrication impossible to discern. A cold realization settled. The lost time was not random, and noticing it might have consequences. The familiar had become alien. Ordinary streets now corridors in a maze designed to disorient. The faintest noise, a tapping, a whisper, the hum of unseen machinery, set nerves on edge, demanding attention, yet promising no clarity. And as the protagonist grappled with the unrelenting distortion, a thought pressed forward, urgent and insistent. Have you ever experienced lost time? Share below, it might be more common than you think. With every passing hour, the sense of being watched intensified, and the understanding dawned. The pattern was growing, the anomaly widening, and soon nothing about the day, the night, or even the town itself could be trusted. Reality had fractured, and every choice, every glance, every step, was now shadowed by the uncertainty of missing hours and the inevitability of what lay hidden within them. Night fell like a weight, pressing the house into deeper shadows, when the protagonist noticed it. A flicker at the edge of vision, almost imperceptible yet insistent. At first, it was dismissed as a trick of the dim light, a reflection, or fatigue manifesting in the corners of perception. But then it moved independently, a shape shifting against the walls, a glow hovering where nothing should be, pausing as if aware of being watched. Heart racing, disbelief fought with the primal urge to flee, yet curiosity anchored the gaze, reluctant but unyielding. The present seemed to respond to the protagonist's own actions. When they turned away, it lingered. When they moved closer, it recoiled subtly, always maintaining an unspoken distance, yet undeniably sentient. Ordinary furniture transformed into silhouettes that played tricks on the mind, shadows stretching unnaturally, as if the room itself had been rewritten to accommodate this intruder. The air grew thick, tinged with a metallic sharpness that made the skin prickle, the faintest hum vibrating through the floor and wall. A soft whisper brushed the ears, indistinct but charged with meaning, sending a jolt through every nerve. Fear surged, not the passive fear of imagined danger, but the acute terror of being observed, studied, and assessed by something that might not be human, might not be bound by comprehension. The protagonist's pulse pounded, each beat echoing in tandem with the subtle rhythm of the presence. the room alive with anticipation, every object conspiring in stillness. And then, in a moment suspended between breath and heartbeat, the glow retreated, dissolving into darkness, leaving behind a room unchanged yet forever different, the ordinary now impossible to trust. The final thought clung like frost on a window. They watched, but who or what are they really? As daylight spilled across the town, the streets appeared serene, almost comforting, a stark contrast to the terror that had seeped into every corner of the protagonist's mind. Birds chirped in the trees, children's laughter echoed from yards, and the ordinary rhythm of life persisted as if nothing had shifted. Yet the deeper investigation revealed a darkness woven through the town's history, invisible to those who never looked closely. Old newspapers told stories of sudden disappearances, of residents vanishing without a trace, of letters never sent, of diaries abruptly ending mid-sentence. The patterns were undeniable. Every decade held its own mystery, every generation whispered warnings, yet no one dared speak openly. In dusty attics and forgotten basements, symbols and artifacts surfaced, strange carvings, jars with unknown contents, photographs of faces now unrecognizable with their eyes scratched out. The protagonist traced the lineage of these anomalies, discovering a chilling link to ritualistic practices that had been passed down, obscured behind polite society and the illusion of normalcy. The ordinary town, so charming under the sun, had been a stage for the extraordinary, a theater of unseen forces manipulating time, perception, and reality itself. Nightfall, however, transformed the familiar into an alien landscape. Shadows deepened unnaturally, windows glowed faintly without reflection, and the whispers returned, now louder, almost intelligible, carrying the weight of decades of secrets. The emotional tension peaked as the protagonist confronted the magnitude of the truth, realizing that every subtle disturbance, every flickering light, every missing hour was not random, it was orchestrated, deliberate, part of a continuum that stretched across generations. The mind strained to reconcile the peaceful day with the sinister night, the comforting streets with the lurking terror, each contrast sharpening the edge of fear. A question pressed forward, urgent and impossible to ignore. Would you confront the source, or leave it buried forever? Every step, every glance, now carried the burden of knowledge, the inescapable understanding that the town's slumber had always been a deception, that beneath the surface of mundane life, forces waited patiently, shaping reality and testing those who dared notice. The weight of history pressed down, mingling dread with awe, leaving the protagonist suspended between action and inaction, curiosity and self-preservation. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the town exhaled a shadowed breath, the ordinary world giving way once again to the extraordinary, to the unknown, and to the creeping certainty that sleep could never be trusted, and the past was far from finished with the present. The protagonist could no longer resist the pull of the unknown, stepping into the dimly lit room where shadows coiled like living things. Each breath felt heavier, the air thick with an unnameable presence, as though the walls themselves exhaled anticipation. Trembling hands reached toward the faint glow lingering at the far corner, a light that seemed almost sentient, pulsing with rhythm in sync with an invisible heartbeat. As the fingers neared, objects around the room shifted violently, chairs scraping against the floor, books tumbling in synchronized chaos, as if the house were alive and reacting to the intrusion. A whisper swelled from nowhere, sharp and guttural, wrapping around the mind, pulling fear and awe into a knot that tightened with every passing second. The protagonist's pulse thundered in the ears, eyes darting between the flickering shadows and the impossibly glowing form, realizing that this was no hallucination. This presence moved with intent, aware, intelligent, and infinitely patient. The room itself seemed suspended between worlds, ordinary furniture twisted into surreal shapes, the familiar becoming grotesque, every object a potential harbinger. A sudden jolt of cold swept through, silencing the air, leaving the sensation of unseen eyes burning into the skin. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the manifestations paused, frozen mid-motion, leaving only a residual tension that vibrated through the floorboards and the very chest. The confrontation had not resolved anything. It had only intensified the unknown, leaving the protagonist with the undeniable truth. Reality could no longer be trusted, and the forces at play were far beyond comprehension. Every instinct screamed to retreat, yet the awe, the horrific curiosity, demanded observation, a witness to something both terrifying and extraordinary. And so the protagonist remained, caught between fear and fascination, knowing that this encounter had irrevocably changed the night, the town, and themselves, leaving a lingering dread that would not easily fade, echoing the simple, terrifying truth. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, they are meant to be endured. Morning light filtered into the house, painting the familiar rooms with the soft glow of normalcy. But the calm was deceptive. Every surface seemed to hum with residual energy. Objects subtly shifted from where they had been left, a cup slightly tilted, a book open to a page the protagonist did not remember reading. The faint hum from beneath the floorboards had not vanished. It lingered, muted yet insistent, threading through the walls like a ghostly pulse. Sounds echoed differently now, footsteps outside carrying a weight they never had before, doors creaking with a deliberation that suggested intention. Sleep had become fragile, a series of interrupted dreams haunted by fleeting shadows and whispers that dissolved the moment they were recognized. Even in the light of day, the protagonist felt eyes upon them, the persistent sensation that something unseen moved in tandem with their own rhythms. A shadow in the corner of vision, a flicker in peripheral sight, each ordinary object now carrying a question mark. Was it truly inert, or had it been subtly altered by what had occurred? The town outside seemed unchanged, neighbors going about routines, but even the streets bore an edge, an unspoken memory of what had transpired. Every glance, every sound, every brush against the air reminded the protagonist that the night had not released its hold, that the events could follow, persist, and expand in ways unseen. And as awareness settled into the marrow, a single thought pierced through, urgent and probing. Could it be following you too? Share your late-night encounters. Even in moments of stillness, the lingering presence whispered. Normality was an illusion, and the line between safety and observation had been forever blurred. The world had returned superficially to order, but beneath it all, the night's secrets remained awake, patient, and watching, ensuring that the protagonist and the audience knew the haunting was far from over. Night settled over the town once again, heavier than before, cloaking streets and rooftops in inky darkness that seemed to thicken with each passing moment. In the distance, faint lights shimmered above the horizon, pulsing with a rhythm that defied understanding, as if communicating in a language the mind could sense but not decipher. The wind carried whispers too soft to fully comprehend, drifting through alleys and empty yards, brushing against windows, slipping beneath doors, leaving a residue of unease in its wake. The protagonist paused at the edge of a street lamp's glow, chest tight with anticipation, noticing a neighbor standing silently across the road. Their eyes met, and a slow, knowing smile curved across a face usually blank with routine. It was a gesture heavy with secrets, a silent acknowledgement that the town had always been more than it appeared, that what had visited or awakened was not gone and perhaps never would be. Every shadow seemed alive, each flicker of distant light a heartbeat, reminding the protagonist that the boundary between the seen and unseen had been irrevocably blurred. Thoughts swirled. Was it over, or just beginning? Had anyone truly understood the forces at play, or were they all players in a story far older and more deliberate than human comprehension? The ordinary streets, the familiar houses, and the quiet whispers of neighbors all now held a duality, an ever-present tension between normalcy and the extraordinary, between safety and the unknown. And in that silence, that still, breathless pause, one question echoed louder than any explanation could. Did they ever really leave? The town held its breath, the lights continued to pulse faintly, and the shadows stretched on into infinity, leaving the audience suspended in uncertainty, hearts racing, minds questioning, compelled to return to the story, to discuss, and to imagine the possibilities that lurked just beyond perception. The ending offered no resolution, only the lingering sense that the night, and the mysteries it carried, was far from finished, leaving the protagonist, the town, and the viewers themselves forever changed by the presence that refused to vanish.